there, and congratulations about the book.
Well, thank you, Mike. Yeah,
You certainly take the reader on a roller coaster ride.
it has been an interesting life, I have to say. Um, through the years, I've made starts at an autobiography and had different ideas about how to approach it, and never really got more than 15 or 20 pages, and it just is like, oh, this is too much to do. But it really the genesis of it happened in coinciding with COVID, actually. Um, there's a man named Robert Corrich, whom I've known for 20 some odd years, and he has a label in England called Red Steel Music. And 20 years ago he put out what was then called the Mad Dog album. And then he kind of went back into whatever his other business is, which I think is real estate or something involved with that. Anyway, but we've stayed in touch, and I've done tours over there where whenever I'm in England, I would try to get in touch with him. And the Malibus, which is my high school band, which lives on through Johnny Z these days, we were booked to play the International Pop Overthrow at the Cavern Club in Liverpool in 2019. So I had a feeling he might come to the show, and I through the 21st century, since early in the aughts, I suppose, I started doing home recordings, and then involving my drummer, which made the recording sound a lot better. And so I had a stockpile of a lot of songs and a lot of recordings. In fact, every year I tried to do an album just for myself, through those years. Because I kept writing and I keep writing, and it's hard not to write once you've had some success. It's hard to, for an hour's worth of work many years ago, Magnet and Steel continues to supply me with a living in some ways. So it's hard not to keep writing songs. Anyway, so I brought those CDs with those songs to Liverpool, and he in fact, Robert did come up there, and I gave him the CDs, and we hung out a little bit, and I've learned enough to not call him the next month and go, hey, what did you think? What did you think? So, I let that lay, and so it was about a year later when, I guess it was March, April of 2020, when COVID visited all of us, that I had a dream about Robert, and I had a dream that he had a helicopter hanging outside of his apartment window. I don't know, it was a funny dream. So I just sent him an email randomly about that, and he got back to me right away, and he said, oh, I'm glad you got in touch, because what's this Pamela album that you gave me last year? And so Pamela album was a series of songs that I wrote, a song cycle about my encounter with Pamela DeBar, the infamous and famous writer and groupie.
Did you meet Robert through Pamela also?
Actually, no. I met Robert, well, here in Franklin. We're in Franklin, Tennessee right now. Beautiful Franklin, historic Franklin. When I first moved here, there was an old wrestler named Lou Rossi who had a health food store, which also featured vinyl. He'd sell records there, used records. And so we went in there one day, Tammy and I, and they had my album. So it was like, hey, you got my album? And they, oh, great, let's take a picture. And I said, he said, well, there's a guy here in town who has a label who's about to put out some of your music. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. No one told me about that. And so I got in touch with him, and it was a guy named John Edwards. He had a label called Renaissance Records, which was not too far from here. And I went and visited, and he was happy to see me, and he tried to enlist me. He said, well, Sony, which owns the rights to my first 4 albums that were on Columbia, Sony is being reluctant to give me the rights to put out this record. He wanted to do a big retrospective of all the albums, especially those early ones. Well, at this point, there really were only the 5 albums. And so, without making it too long of a story, one day when I was there, Robert Corrich happened to be there, and he had been doing some business with John Edwards, and he expressed an interest, and he specializes in remastering old records and things. And I guess he was here for a week or so, maybe a little longer. And during that time, I got in touch with Sony, and they said, well, the reason we haven't licensed the songs is because he hasn't paid us for the ones that we've already. And so once
You've been
just
in the music industry for a while.
A small red flag went up, and was like, okay. And shortly thereafter, John Edwards took most of the money from the company and split for the coast with his young secretary, and left what was left of Renaissance Records in the hands of his general manager, whose name I cannot remember, I'm sorry to say. But Robert was there, and so the general manager asked me, so do you have anything else you could put out? And I said, well, yeah, I've got an album that we half finished in the mid-'80s. It's only on cassette. And so Robert chimed in, well, I can remaster that. And so he took it, remastered it, and that turned into the Lost album in America and the Mad Dog album in Great Britain. And so that was the beginning of it. And then he used some live recordings that I had of a concert I did in Dallas, and also in Toronto, I believe the other one was at the El Macambo, and made an album or CD of those songs, and he called it "The Meaning of Live," which I try to have funny titles to my CDs.
I was going to say that. You like to play around with words.
Yeah, well, words keep the mind alive as far as... And my mother was a copywriter and a copy director in advertising, and so I grew up in a household which was, very creative in the madman sense of the word. If you've ever seen Mad Men, that was kind of my parental unit, my stepfather and my mother. So yeah, I've always loved words, and I've always I was, the editor of the literary magazine in high school and all those kind of things. And I wanted to be a writer when I went to Georgetown, and that's a whole other story. But so The Meaning of Live, he manufactured, I think, I don't know, about 500 copies of it, but he never really released it or promoted it, and that was where we kind of lost touch until my dream and COVID brought us back together, and and the song cycle. Tammy and I, my wife and I, were married about 20 years, and then we separated in 2001, and were divorced within a couple of years after that. So I was living the bachelor life for many years, and so when my daughter Daphne wanted to go to California on our first trip out there, she said, now don't get this wrong, Dad, but I really love this book. And she pulled out Pamela's book, I'm With the Band. And I said, well, that's funny, I think I did meet her on one of the Brooklyn Cowboys tours in the early aughts, and let's see what she's up to. And so I contacted her through Facebook, and she invited us to come and visit. She was having some kind of, yard sale of her groupie couture, as she called it. And so we went and visited, and, and the lonely guy in me was, was struck, and I thought, oh, this is an interesting woman. And so I wound up writing all these songs about my feelings for her, because I would go out to LA maybe 3 or 4 times a year while Daphne was there, and because the Malibus are based there too, and so I would combine those visits and sort of my courtship of Miss Groupie, and and so he liked the song cycle because it does chronicle the those hopeful beginnings, and has it, you think it's going to work, and it doesn't, and then you kind of, oh, is it me, is it them? And then with the sober, end of it there with the old songs about...
I'm thinking about a song of a friend of mine's, and it's about meeting this woman at an airport, but the line is, all love stories, long or short, seem to end the same way.
Well, the unrequited love songs are usually the ones that are the best anyway, I think, because a lot of people can relate to those. But yeah, I mean, of course, the song cycle ends with, you know, "Hell, I Know It's Over" is the name of that song. So yeah, and this was put away. This was their 2013, 2014 when this was happening, and so by the time Robert came up with saying he liked these songs, my wife and I had gotten back together. We were living together, and we were like, and I was like, "Oh, this is awkward," and but you know that is not uncommon in my songwriting and dating career. I mean, way back when Magnet and Steel, of course, famously was written about my crush on Stevie Nicks, and by the time that was a hit, I was with, certainly not with Stevie, and the woman that I was with was very jealous of that, and you know, and I would still be hanging out with those people sometimes.
There's a quote in the book of yours, and I think it was in one of your journals, that you come to the realization and say, perhaps I became a songwriter to write love songs.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, the poetic tradition of the troubadour singing the love ballads. I've learned about that through the years of reading. You know, this is, you know, whatever, the 16th century and 17th century, where they would. You know, if you were in love with a woman or enamored by the woman, they would sing the song for you. Like, you know, that the Steve Martin movie is kind of that way. The Roxanne, I guess it is, the Cyrano de Bergerac thing. So yeah, I think I certainly haven't written other topical songs other than love songs, but yeah, I mean, it's funny how that pops up, but I think, you know, if you look at the history of pop music, it's a lot of romance anyway, and we're old enough to have lived through the 50s, and of course that was when I started listening to music, and those were mostly all love songs. You didn't get a lot of protest songs in the 50s or anything, and then when
they came 10 years later.
Yeah, folk music came in, then we started to realize what was going on in the world.
You said the troubadour, and I was thinking when you were talking about Robert that there are certain people that you don't realize it at the time, and then when you get to look back at it, they become pinnacle for some reason or another. And there's certain dates and places also. You mentioned the troubadour, and so I'm going to take you back to February 2nd, 1976,
Yeah.
which was one of those things which you didn't realize at the time, and then it was that pivot point, I think.
Yeah. Well, you know, I got a guitar when I was 15, and within a year, my friend in high school, John Zambetti, said, if you get an electric guitar, you can be in the band. And that was the Malibus. And, you know, and that continued through the years. And it was... well, the band Sageworth, my cousin Jimmy has, I think you know Jim. Jim and I were born so close to one another. I think astrologically we've had some parallels in our lives. And Jim was succeeding big time, and his band was making it and making records, and Sageworth, my band, was still struggling.
Let me just put in that the band was called Repairs.
Of
just
course,
to give them
the
that
Repairs.
plug, yeah.
We all remember the Repairs, and they had made some great music, and it was curious that they got on the what was it, the Rare Earth label, and the Mo West, was that the other? They put a couple of albums out, and yeah, I mean, we were a little jealous of that, but we were also inspired to try and make it, and my band, you know, we got to be a big band in D.C. Sageworth was the band, and then we had an offer to come to L.A. and make records, except half the band thought that was too risky, and so we compromised and decided to move to Boston. So I'm not sure what is at the time it was. There's a lot of schools there. There are a lot of clubs there. It seems like a good scene for a working band. You know.
You said a lot of schools there, and right when you said Boston, you know, I'm thinking to Spinal Tap, where where the gig gets canceled.
Yeah.
Not a big college town.
Yeah. That's a great movie. I love that movie.
Well, so go back to the Troubadour gig.
So anyway, yeah. So when the band broke up, I spent about a month, or well, a few months. This was '73, and then got together and with some other people that I used to play with, and Annie McClune, who was the lead singer for Sageworth. She and I joined a band, and we called it Dangerfish, and it was kind of biding our time, but I had the longing to be in LA, and so I finally decided, after being robbed twice in Boston, that maybe if I'm going to struggle, I could struggle in the sunshine. So in April of '74, I moved to Boston. I moved from Boston, to LA, at the behest of a guy named Chris Darrow, who was a great guy, but also a great instrumentalist. He had been in the band Kaleidoscope and Nitty Gritty Dirt Band, and he had been putting out some albums on his own during this time. And so when I contacted, he was the one who wanted to produce Sageworth. And so when I told him the band had broken up, he was like, "Great, you can come and be in my band." So I moved in to his spare room out in LA in April of '74, and within 2 weeks, United Artists, which was the label he was on in England, had withdrawn their tour support for him. And so he said, "Do you really want to be my band?" And I said, "Well, sure. I just drove across the country to be in LA, but sure, let's go to England." So I went to England for a month with him. During that time in England, I met his A&R man there named Andrew Lauder, who's a really great guy. And he 2 years later, after getting back to LA and struggling, well, you're talking about February of '76, which was kind of the point where all the struggles in LA that I'd been doing for about 2 years had come to a head. I was crashing on the couch of one of the members of the band that we had at the time, which I think we might have been calling ourselves Wheels at that point. But he said, "You could get a job. They're looking for a dishwasher at the cafe down the street here. It'd be great if you guys could pay some rent," because the drummer was also living in the house with them. And the bass player had been playing with Johnny Tillotson, and he said, "Well, why don't you come and play with Johnny Tillotson with me?" And in the meantime, there had been other avenues opening up in LA, but none of them had really panned out. And so we did a hoot night at the Troubadour, the famous venue there on Santa Monica Boulevard. And, going to the gig, the bass player said, if it happens tonight, that's great. Otherwise, I'm out. And it's like, oh, okay, nice to know. And we had been working with a guy named Greg Lurick, who I inherited from Chris Darrow. It was Chris Darrow's manager and A&R guy there. So yeah, we did it was like a 7 or 8 song set, and as in Sageworth, I was the songwriter and the guitar player, but I was not bold enough to be the singer. And I thought everybody else sang better than I did. So we did those songs, although I did sing one of the songs we did that night. Anyway, so I sang the one song that night, and a week later, Greg's secretary, Kathy Sherry, called me and said that Andrew really liked me, but not the band. And so I was like, oh well, okay. But he wants me to sing too, and so he was offering a 6-song deal with United Artists in England, which meant an A and B side for 3 singles. So he liked the songwriting, and I guess he heard enough of me singing that he thought I could do it. So with that in hand, this was the door opening that I had been looking for ever since I'd moved to LA 2 years earlier. And it was like, okay, well, let's find a producer. And so it's like, well, can we get Brian Wilson? Can we get Todd Rundgren? Can we get John Fogerty? And then we had also been doing demos at a studio which has become famous in the years since then, called Sound City in Van Nuys. It was just a kind of a funky studio out in the valley, and the engineer, Dwayne Scott, said to me, well, how about Buckingham Nicks? And I was like, who is that? Is that a guy? Who is that? There was a guy named Don Nicks at the time who was doing Southern rock, and he said, no, they're from Fleetwood Mac. And I said, Fleetwood Mac, but they're like a blues band, and they're a psychedelic blues band, and I'm not doing that kind of music. No, here, listen to this album. And he gave me the Buckingham Nicks album, which was a revelation to me. I felt a real kinship with the songs and the fact that Sageworth had been that kind of a band where it was a male and female, but a female singer, and so despite the, I thought, overly done arrangements, which were kind of orchestral and more so than I wanted my record to be, it was like, great, this is good. And then listen to the Fleetwood Mac album, and that was when the White album, what they call the White album, the first album they did with Buckingham Nicks, came out, and Over My Head and Rhiannon and those songs were... Yeah, well, no, this was before Rumors. This was the White album. They call it the White album. It's the one with the bolo. Mick is standing there with the bolo, and Stevie is doing the dance. And so, but it says produced by Fleetwood Mac. So I was like, well, okay, but who is this? And so I got together, and we went to a Fleetwood Mac concert in Santa Barbara that spring, and I got to meet Lindsay and see them in action, and I was well impressed. I thought, this is great. This is the kind of stuff I'd love to do. And Lindsay was very personable and was talking backstage and said, well, Stevie and I are on the out, so I think it's just going to be me producing it. It's like, oh, well, okay. But she sure sings good, and she's quite a person, I was quite taken by her and her chiffon blowing in the wind. It was an outdoor daytime concert. But and then within the week, they had mended their fence. And the fact was that they wanted to maintain their Buckingham Nicks identity out of Fleetwood Mac, because they'd been in the band for a couple of years at that point, I guess. 75, I think, is when they joined. So it was in the second year. And they wanted to maintain their brand. So that was how that began. And then I got to meet Stevie, and was quite taken by her. And she was curiously insecure at that point, where and I was like, God, you're such a good singer, Stevie. You're so... She said, really? You think so? Oh, yeah, I don't know. It was before the icon had settled into her persona, I guess. But so I found it one of those things where Lindsay and I had a lot of the same influences of the Beach Boys and Kingston Trio, and so when we got together, it was like meeting a brother that I didn't know I had, or something, kind of. So that was the neat thing. And so, yeah, this all came out of that hoot night at Troubadour that night, and then, I had no idea at the time that...
I think that I have the timing right, that you wrote in your journal, I think I'm ready for this.
Well, that was the part that I had to make the leap of faith to say that I could sing an album. It was that I never had, I always, when I told my mother I was moving to LA to make a record, she was like, oh, well, okay. And it was like, I had no idea how that was really going to pan out. I always imagined it would be something like the band that I had been in, where I would play guitar and I would have something to do with the arrangements and certainly write the songs as much as I could. But yeah, I never imagined being a front person or a lead singer, even though, in the Malibus we used to do covers, and and I could sing oldies, and in Sageworth I would sing some oldies and stuff too, and I enjoyed doing that. I just never thought I had a very good voice.
Yeah, and when you were talking about Stevie and saying she was insecure about the voice that she had, and you said, "What are you kidding?"
Right.
That I could have said that to you as I was reading part of the book, because I was
Well,
surprised
I appreciate
how
that.
insecure it seemed you were and how not confident you were about singing.
Yeah.
And I was thinking to say, "What is he kidding?"
Well, I guess you're your own worst critic in a lot of ways, and I don't think I think it's unseemly to sit around and listen to yourself sing anyway. So when I would hear myself sing, I'd go, yeah, okay, whatever. It's just my voice, you know. But I think I was bolstered very much so by having Stevie and Lindsay behind me and sort of as part of my band in the studio. I mean, I had great respect for them as I got to know them, and they you know, seemed to have it for me. And I know in my journal I was like, I was singing the vocal, and she was looking at me through the control room window, and I was like, oh, this is the thing. And you know, but that was the truth. It's a strange kind of objective subjective thing of, I've grown to appreciate a little bit how to sing, you know, from the diaphragm and that kind of thing, and trying to make it interesting if I can. But again, I don't love to sit around and listen to myself sing, except when I'm judging what I've recorded, and then go, well, okay, I think that's good. Yeah, I think that. But I enjoy doing it as I do it. That's the other part. That's the subjective part of it, where I've come to, you know, as anything creative or artistic, I guess you say, it's a self-expression, and it's something that you can do. That, you know, if I've written the words and if I've made the melody, and so to enact that is kind of a creative exercise.
You said, as anything creative, and I'm thinking about you and thinking, if it's anything creative, Walter can do it.
Well,
do it well.
I have learned that I enjoy trying my hands at different forms of creativity, and I think again that probably comes from my parental unit. My stepfather was the art director in the advertising agency they worked for, so he taught my cousin Jim and I how to paint and to draw and to do watercolors and India ink things. So we used to do Yogi Bear and you know, Crusader Rabbit things, and my mother with the words. She was always a wordsmith, and she I guess, you know, of course, on a certain level you want to separate from your parents, and on the other level you want to please them if you can, I think.
It's still part of the DNA.
Yeah, I think it is. And so I went to college to be a writer. That was the thought I had. I had gotten advanced placement English, and so I expected to get that when I got to Georgetown, and they said, no, you got to take freshman English. You're not getting that. Until the end of freshman year, when they said, oh, yeah, you should have had that, and so your English requirement is done. At that point, I started thinking, well, I guess I could be a writer no matter what I take, and I was drawn to nobody went to Georgetown in 1966 or 67 to be an artist. There was a very small art, you know, department there, and that appealed to me. I think I've always enjoyed more of the big fish in a small pond approach to things, and so you got your personal instruction. The teachers were really good. Professor Kiefo, who taught painting and silk screening, was a great guy to encourage creative ideas. He would say, okay, well, come up with an idea and then put it away, come up with another idea. You know, he'd say, try to get 3 ideas before you decide what you're going to paint or what you're going to create. And I always have kept that with me. And the sculpture I actually wound up being a sculpture major, a Bachelor of Fine Arts with sculpture concentration. And the woman named Joan Carroll was the sculpture teacher, and I did a lot of metal sculpture, which I found kind of visceral and really...
It's a great picture in the book of the sculpture you...
Yeah, and that was the funny, odd thing of, whatever, how many years later out of school, I never really got much out of my art degree until I started being a substitute teacher here in Franklin, and they had career day, and the artist came to my classroom, and I said, hey, I got a degree, what can I do? He said, well, I'm looking for someone who could weld. And so I said, hey, that's me. So yeah, I spent the next 6 months creating the statue that he had been commissioned to do. So yeah, it's funny to have these kind of things happen in my life. I don't know. I feel like I've had a very lucky life in a lot of ways. But I've also learned that if you sort of count on the luck, it doesn't work. It's like you're going to have to, you take it for granted, but don't assume anything. That's a famous saying.
As I saw your set list from last night and saw that you're starting with a Rolling Stone song, I thought about sort of a full circle in terms of Sageworth's last song was Honky Tonk Woman.
Yeah.
And
that's true. I hadn't even thought about that.
But then I started thinking about these circles, and I thought about I thought about Graham Parsons and your connection with Graham Parsons and Hearts on Fire and Carolina Calypso as that circle also. Mm-hmm. We got to talk about Graham.
Yeah, we should talk about Graham. From 1965, I had been a big fan of the Byrds. The Byrds, obviously everyone knows about the Byrds, but they were the first folk rock band, and they were inspired to be a rock band by the Beatles and the 12-string that George Harrison played. And so, yeah, I from Mr. Tambourine Man on. In fact, the Malibus, I think we did Turn, 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 and it might have been another Byrds song, but I had been a Byrds fan through the years, and then they moved from folk to more psychedelic music. So yeah, they were famous and one of my favorite bands. And then in '68, they put out an album called Sweetheart of the Rodeo, which came out of left field to most of the Byrds fans. It was a straight-on country and western album that pulled no punches. I mean, Ringo Starr used to sing a country song, and it was always like kind of joking, kind of a tongue-in-cheek thing, because in 1968, the separation between the country music fan, a la the redneck contingent in the Americas, and the hippies on the other side of the spectrum, this was there was not a lot of cross collateralization there between the two. And so for the Byrds to do a country album out of the blue like that took us by surprise. I came to love the album, and I was a inveterate album liner note reader, and I was like, G. Parsons, who is G. Parsons? He's the new guy in this band, and why is what he's done put these new musical ideas into the band? So yeah, I was a crazy music fan in those days. I had a radio show on WGTB at Georgetown, so I was paying attention to everything that was going on. I had the first issue of Rolling Stone, and as the San Francisco music scene developed, there was a fanzine called the Mojo Navigator Rock and Roll News that I had a subscription to. And so I did my research and found out it was this guy Graham Parsons, and so I started trying to figure out why and who he was and what was going on with that. Meanwhile, kind of getting into the country rock developing that was going on, from the folk rock to the country rock, and the Buffalo Springfield was doing it, and Poco, and there were, there were more than the Byrds at that point doing that, and so Sageworth followed right along, and I started trying to write some country songs. Flying Burrito Brothers came out in '69, and that put a whole new spin on it, because there they were in the nudie suits, and this kind of, wow, this is crazy, this is cool stuff. And Sneaky Pete was playing like hard rock licks on the pedal steel, while it was a revelation, and I loved that music, and I loved that album. Shortly thereafter, and I guess in 1970, after graduating, Sageworth was doing pretty well in Washington D.C., and we were doing a gig at the club called the Cellar Door, and well, actually, no, that's wrong. We were doing a gig at the club called Apple Pie. Meanwhile, at the Cellar Door across the street, Linda Ronstadt had come into town to do a week there, because that was the kind of middle-level club where people who had had records that were in the top 10 or in the top 20 would come and play for a week. And so they loaded in. It was a Sunday night, and they were looking for something to eat, and came across the street to Apple Pie and heard Sageworth playing. And Linda was a great girl, and she brought the band in. They sat down and ate, and they called us over, and they wanted to meet us, and they were just very friendly to us. We brought them back to the Sageworth house, which is where most of us were living, and just got to know them really well. And Linda was doing a brand of country rock in those days, and so I was aspiring to be into that kind of Southern California country rock scene, and Graham was part of that. So concurrent with that, we were playing in a circuit around Georgetown and D.C. Well, I guess she was young, just like all of us were. Emmylou Harris was playing the same circuit, and we got to be friends with Emmylou. She was doing more of a Judy Collins brand of music in those days, where she was covering some kind of Broadway songs, and wearing long velvet gowns and things, and so we'd go to her gigs and she'd come to ours. And one night, the Burritos without Graham were playing the Cellar Door, and Chris Hillman went down to the club where Emmylou was playing, called Clyde's, and discovered Emmylou and got in touch with Graham, who had been looking for a singing partner. And he came to town the next day or so. I think he had been in Baltimore or something before that. Anyway, the night that he came in, I happened to be in the club with Emmy, and she didn't know who Graham Parsons was, and I said, well, this was before Graham came to town, when Chris had sort of asked her about it. She didn't know who Graham was, so I took her back to the house and played Gilded Palace of Sin and Sweetheart of the Rodeo for her, and then when Graham came to town, they were looking for a place where they could just kind of sing together for a while, and hey, you can sing at our house. So yeah, and by this time I had a very high opinion of Graham, of what he was doing, and I thought he was real cool and all of that stuff. And he did have a great charisma when you met him, and so he showed up at the house with Emmy, and had his nudie jacket on, and it was...
I'm still picturing the back of that album with the back of Graham and the nudie.
I know, I mean, and that was the thing these days with these phones that we have. This would have been documented, to the hilt, but it really just lives on in my memory, and I'm not even sure if it lives on in Emmylou's memory as well, but I can tell you it was true. We sat in the kitchen, they sang Sweet Dreams, they sang That's All It Took, and they sang those songs together, and I was just blown away by how wonderful it sounded, and
wow.
And I was like, Graham, you know, I'm really liking country music now. What should I do? What should I listen to? He said, you got to listen to George Jones and Merle Haggard and Charlie Pride, which
So
I
tie
took.
in Hearts of Fire to that story.
Okay, well, from there I had gotten the country rock bug completely, and we were integrating some, you know, it wasn't God who made Honky Tonk Angels and some, you know, the obvious country songs to do in our band to try and be more country rockish. And and of course I was writing songs. I started writing songs within the first year of having a guitar, and so it was something that I had developed, and I liked the idea of being a songwriter, and so I considered myself a songwriter at this point. And I wanted to write a country song. I had sort of toyed with it a little bit before that, but never really gotten anything that I thought was any good. And there was a band called Asleep at the Wheel that we were speaking about earlier, and they were a great sort of honky-tonk country band. And Ray Benson, the tall lead guitar and singer of the band, was hanging out with us one day. Annie McClune, who was our lead singer, was this really personable gal, and everybody loved Annie, and so the people would come around, kind of bees around a flower with Annie sometimes, and so she just was an easy friend for a lot of people. She was very gregarious in that way, and she still is, of course. But so Ray was hanging out, and I said, Ray, there's this lick that you do. Could you teach me? And it's a way that ends country songs, and it just goes through like 4 octaves on the guitar neck, ding diddle 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 ding diddle 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 ding diddle 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 ding ding ding. And so he taught me that lick that day, and after he left, I was inspired to write the song "Hearts on Fire." And originally it was tongue-in-cheek, as was my wont, and it, you know, jokes about heartburn and you know, doctor give me some antacid or something for my heartburn, which, you know, were a little cumbersome, but they, you know, it was a good song. It had a good melody and good changes. So we were performing it in Sageworth for a while. One of our friends was a guy named Tom Geiderer, who was a bass player, and he was good friends with Emmylou. Good friends. And he one day was saying, you know, that song of yours, it's a really good song, but the lyrics are a little weird. And so he helped me revise some of the lines, and he said, yeah, I think this is really great. Emmylou heard us doing it, and she thought, wow, yeah, this is really good. In the meantime, this was when she was being courted by Graham, and she took the song to Graham, and Graham liked it. And so, amazingly, it got on the Grievous Angel album, and that was my big breakthrough. Although, previous to that, there was a lady, an old blues lady named Esther Mae Scott, Mama Scott, who played around D.C., and she recorded one of my songs called "Come to Me," which was technically my first cover.
You were saying I thought it was a good song. I'd heard, I don't know if this is true or not, I'd heard that you weren't thinking this is a good song with Magnet and Steel after you wrote it. Or that it wouldn't be the hit on the album.
Well, I certainly didn't bring it in with that in mind. It was the oddball out of that second album that I did. It was a throwback to a 50s thing, to the Stroll, which I fondly remembered from the Dick Clark days. Chuck Willis, the king of the Stroll. And there was the Diamonds who did that song, The Stroll. And I really liked that beat where every other snare beat was a double hit, and it was technically 6/8 for you musicians in the audience. And yeah, I certainly didn't come in and go, here's our hit, this is going to be my breakthrough. And and of course I felt like I was more of a rocker than a crooner anyway. So this, the first album I don't know how many ballads, strict ballads I had. I had some moderate tempo ones. Yes, I Guess I Am, and Feel So Good were kind of that way, but there weren't a lot of ballads.
Only the Lucky?
Only the Lucky is
Yeah.
up-tempo moderato, I think. No, yeah, no, you know, yeah, I didn't consider myself a ballad singer anyway, so that was definitely in there. So yeah, but it was an honest song, and it was, of course, we songwriters try to impress the ladies by writing songs that have
Perhaps you
something to do
became a
with that.
songwriter
Yeah.
to write love songs.
Well, there you go. It all makes sense now. So yeah, um, it wasn't until the album was pretty much in the can that stuck out to everybody as something special. Whether anybody really thought it was going to be a hit, who knows? I mean, but the people at the label, who were ultimately the ones who decide all these things, they definitely felt like it was going to be a good song to put out. So, yeah, no, it was just,
Well, I go back to you saying, I think I'm ready for this.
yeah.
And there's this,
Well, I guess it all falls into place if it's meant to be, and that's, we all like to think we're leading charmed lives, but whether or not they are.
Well, so you're sitting in the studio there, you're writing and recording Magnet and Steel. You're being produced by
The object of my affection, yes.
and Lindsey Buckingham
Yeah.
and Stevie Nicks, and they're coming out with the album Rumors there.
Well, that was the other thing, of course. In order to be able to work with those guys, even at the get-go, which was that 6-song thing, it had to be around their schedule. And at first, they were trying to keep it apart from Fleetwood Mac, so it was kind of on the down low, as they say. And then, as it was turning out, they were really liking the songs. They were liking the way the recordings were coming out, and of course, having their voices on there with me, and Lindsay's guitar, just really made it special. And suddenly, the people who were, Greg Lewick, who was promoting it to the labels, was like, yeah, this is turned out pretty well. I had been courted by A&M Records a little bit at that point. A guy named David, whatever his name, it's in the book, look it up, who had always thought that even doing this deal with United Artists was a ticket to oblivion, a la Chris Darrow, which is how he put it to me. And he thought I should try to get covers of my songs, and that way get a reputation, and then try to put a record out. But then when he heard the tracks with Stevie and Lindsay, it was like, oh, well. So A&M was trying to do like a worldwide deal, offer for a deal. And Greg had this concept of doing territorial deals, whereby we would keep more control and anyway, I thought it was a great strategy, and ultimately it has paid off a little bit, because those first 4 albums, even as we speak, are about to be re-released by a label called Liberation Hall outside of North America, because North America, Sony has the rights for them in North America. So,
When you were talking way back when about John Edwards, I was remembering a quote from maybe your journal, but definitely the book, where you said, you can't spell music business without BS. And so I'm thinking about it again. I got to throw that out.
Oh, yeah, well,
let you, react to
hyperbole
it.
is the lingua franca of the music business. It's, a friend of mine who actually was the reason I moved to Tennessee, or one of the contacts that I had when I moved here, a guy named Rob Strandlin. Rob is more of a country artist, and he co-wrote Already Gone with Jack Tempchin. And he goes way back to my early days in California in 74, 75. I was playing bass in his country band just to keep some money coming in. And Rob co-wrote a song with Pinkard and Bowden, Richard Bowden, who was a really funny guy, it was a parody on Islands in the Stream, and it's called Music Industry, and I'll try to quote it. It's like, music industry, that is what we are. No one plays for free. Everyone's a star. Sign the bottom line. We'll have lunch sometime, and we can lie to each other. Uh-huh. While we call each other brother. Uh-huh. Which is so perfect for what the music business is, because it really is. It's like everyone is trying to use everybody else, I think. There's not too many altruistic people in the music business, I don't think, unless they've made it to a certain degree, which was great for me with Lindsay and Stevie, because they were just acceding to their amazing stardom that they came to. But at the time they were, Fleetwood Mac was this blues band, and suddenly they were doing these kind of popish songs, and then came Over My Head, then came Rihanna, and then came, then Rumors, blew it away.
They're in stadiums.
Yeah, and all of a sudden they were huge. And then Stevie, of course, has gone on with, and Lindsay too, but Stevie has become such an icon that, the kids in high school go, "Did you really know Stevie Nicks? Did you?" It's like, "Oh yeah, I did." Yeah, it's a funny thing, and that's why I ironically wear that button. I don't know if you saw the button I wear on my guitar strap. Daphne and I, my daughter and I, went to Atlanta, and they were selling buttons. They had this bowl full of buttons, and they were looking through all these funny buttons, and there was one that said, "I slept with Stevie Nicks." And so I got that and I put it on my guitar strap. I always thought that was funny, but it's like, "Oh yeah, she was giving out buttons." Don't worry. Yeah.
You mentioned about playing bass when you wanted to get a little extra money, and there's a story in the book that you didn't really flesh out as much. You didn't flesh it out as much as it made me wonder, and that's that you're in New York, you were looking at the classifieds in the Village Voice for musicians, came across something that said, "We're looking for somebody, our band is influenced by Fleetwood Mac, Tom Petty, and Walter Egan," and you answered that ad. Yeah. And I'm just picturing your reaction, but also especially their reaction when it's like, I am influenced a lot by Walter Egan.
Well, yeah, that's my surrealistic life, that to see something like that would happen. And Craig and Eddie were the guys. They were Staten Island guys, and they were putting together a band. And we got together a little bit and jammed, and ultimately I got a Buick out of it, a Buick Skylark that I bought that Eddie was selling, and Craig worked at a gas station there, and so. But yeah, no, we never really played anywhere. But I thought that was a kind of a cool thing too that happened. But yeah, those kind of strange things you never imagine, to be an answer in a crossword puzzle in the New York Times or something is. And my grandmother faithfully did the New York Times crossword puzzles through all those years, and I always think of her when that kind of thing happens. But yeah, on the Family Feud, they had Richard Dawson, the kissing guy. The answer was a full moon, and this is when I had my song "Full Moon Fire" out, and he, when that was the answer, he sang that, and so it was like, oh, this is really weird. But yeah, and it comes down to, I go shopping at Kroger over here, and Magnet and Steel will come on the music that's playing, and I'm like, oh, okay, here we go.
What goes through your mind when you?
Well, it's obviously it's a pleasant thing to think that, and then, of course the flip side of that is when you go around, well, when are they going to play it again? When am I going to hear it again? So, yeah, you have to take all that kind of stuff with a grain of salt, and I've found that the best way to keep a level head about things is to invest yourself in the creative process and try to be as honest you can with the songs you write, with the performances you give, and
never know what's going to happen.
Right, and then not expect to. My grandmother always used to say, "You're better than no one, and no one's better than you." And I always tried to take that to heart, and I think It's a good way to approach life anyway.
So I know the stated backstory of Hot Summer Nights, and my question is, did Lindsey Buckingham say write a different song, and overnight you wrote Hot Summer Nights? Or?
Yeah, I did. As a matter of fact, it. You know, I was still in the process of trying to impress Stevie when she said to me, "Well, they don't want to do my song," and I was like, "Well, you know, I like it. It's a good song. I'll do it." And so we learned it on the road in '77, and I was using it as part of my set for the rest of that year, which wasn't as long a tour as I would have liked it to be. But that's because my Only the Lucky, you mentioned it earlier, was my first single, and that kind of petered out in mid-chart, like 50 something, 54, 56. And so Columbia was like, well, and I had signed this 6-album deal with Columbia, and when Lindsey and Stevie got involved in it, and so did one of my manager was Greg Lewick, and Greg partnered with a guy named David Krebs, who had been managing Aerosmith out of New York. So I had an East Coast and a West Coast management, and he had good connections at Columbia, and he got this great deal. Instead of 6 songs, it was 6 albums and some advanced money. That was like, really? Oh, this is good. This is nice. So yeah, it it was. But I thought it was a great song, and so they wanted us to come off the road and record the second album. And as we got to doing the basic tracks, we were breaking down, and obviously Lindsey had heard this song before, and he came out and he was like this wry smile on his face. He's like, "So, what's this song?" He was like, "Well, Stevie said you guys didn't want to do it, and I like the song. I'll do it. Yeah, you better go home." And in those days, for the two-sided albums, there was always the big climax song for the second side, at least in my mind, as I conceptualized how an album should run, the flow. And so, yeah, it was the summer. It was August, and I was driving down Beverly Glen, thinking about we had a battle of the bands that the Malibus had played in, and just summertime meant music to me, and so it was somehow connecting to the old days with those bands, and the way songs come out. I sit down and I noodle on the guitar, and I think about it, and sometimes, if I'm lucky, the idea for the words and the music come together at the same time.
Just go home tonight and write a song that can put an exclamation point on this album. Okay, Lindsey.
Well, that's the thing. I think the inspiration of those people and how amazing their output was becoming during those times inspired me to of course I can do that. I'll go home and let me see what I can come up with. I'll see you tomorrow. It's like, I mean, not to compare myself with the Beatles, but the way that they, we got 2 weeks in Paris, we got to write the next album, and they write these amazing songs, and even the pluck, if you'll excuse the expression, that they that Peter Jackson film displays. It's like, we're gonna write an album while you film us, and we're going to do a concert of it in 2 weeks. It's like, oh, sure, of course, we'll do that. And maybe at their prime they might have been able to do something like that, but by that time they couldn't. But yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty small change for me to think that, oh yeah, I'll go and write a song. But the thing was, Magnet and Steel had been written before my inspiration to write it about her. It was more like the hook line was, in fact, I have a cassette of it I heard the other day, just randomly. This, instead of "with you I'm not a magnet," the Magnet and Steel line is "don't turn away now," which is very pedestrian. It's not a very memorable kind of hook, if you want to use that word which is the songwriting word for the part of the song that makes you want to listen to it again,
What song are you most proud of that you wrote?
Oh, it's like asking
Yeah.
Which of
What's
my
your favorite
children? Which of
kid?
my children do I
Yeah.
love? I mean, I, I can't. I really can't answer that. I mean, I usually flippantly go, well, the last song that I wrote, and it might be that I wrote a song. I co-wrote a song with a woman named Beth Sass. Careful, you have to pronounce her name carefully, but
Yeah.
Beth is a great singer and songwriter that I've been collaborating with for the last 5 years or so, and we've been laboring over this song for a year, and finally got to this point, and it's called Kintsugi Love. Do you know about kintsugi? The
No.
concept of kintsugi. Kintsugi is a Japanese concept of if you like break a vase and you put it back together with kind of this gold glue or something, by melting gold to keep it together. It is stronger and better after having broken and put back together. And so the concept of, how I feel about being back together with Tammy after we were apart for so long, and that we're able to be together again. That's kind of what that song is about. So I'd have to say that one at this point. But
Well, you've written about over 10 songs with Beth, right?
I have. We put out an EP in 2018, I think it was, that came out. We called it Webs, which is my initials and hers, W-E and B-S. Once again,
Yeah.
the music business comes into mind. But yeah, no, Beth is a great singer who is a real go-getter. She's started the Nashville chapter of the Composers Breakfast Club that my friend John is a big proponent of back in Malibu.
You reminded me of my friend Tom, who married a woman named Sass, and has to be very careful when he said, "This is my wife, Sass."
I know. I try to avoid the joke possibilities with her, but no, Beth is a sassy lady. She's very.
So we should talk about movies a bit, and in fact, movie soundtracks. I know you're a movie buff.
Well, yeah.
But I mentioned Hot Summer Nights, and that's been in movies, Magnet and Steel too.
More Magnet and Steel than Hot Summer Nights. Hot Summer Nights has done better with covers. I mean, for a song which we didn't really quite finish the discussion of it. Yeah, Lindsay sent me home, and I had 3 chords, and I put them together, and the next day we sat down and recorded that song the way that it is on the album. Although if you listen to the single, you'll notice it's a little faster. On the single, it was goosed a little bit for the 45 version of it. But yeah, and the fact that everybody thought that was going to be the hit and should be the hit after Magnet, that's an ongoing bone of contention that I have with Columbia Records. The fact that
Rewind this to you can't spell music business
yeah,
without
exactly.
BS.
Well, Columbia Records was a huge company, and still is, I guess, as Sony. It's even huger, probably. And when they saw that Fleetwood Mac, Rumors, Buckingham Nicks, it's on our record here, look at that. And they got behind it big time. Magnet and Steel climbed to number 8 over the time. It was released, I think, in March and peaked, I think, in September. So that summer it was blanketed. It was there, and it didn't keep its bullet, which is something that it's supposed to keep rising on the charts. But they believed in it enough that they put the weight of the company behind it, whatever that means, and made it succeed. It's a million seller, and I have the gold record in the other room to prove it. So, but they milked it, and the stations that went on in March, April, May were looking to go to the next song by that time, and of course, yeah, that's the smaller markets, but they were playing Hot Summer Nights, and as the summertime came, they were playing deep tracks of Hot Summer Nights. But Columbia didn't release it as the single. It was not until October, November that they put it out as a single.
Timing.
And it's like, well, why didn't
Cool fall.
cool
fall.
Yeah,
evenings.
The head of the company was named Walter Yetnikoff, and when Magnet and Steel was the highest ranking song on the Columbia family of labels at the CBS convention that fall, I think it was September. They had a suite up at Century City, and Greg, my manager, and I went to go up and kiss butt to oh yes, we love you guys, yeah, and have them give us all their wanking. Oh yes, we love you guys too, and yeah, we're gonna make the album sell through, and famous quotes from that meeting were, we break artists, and it's like, yeah, we break them. There's two meanings to that. And we kept begging them to get Hot Summer Nights out and really keep going, and and Yetnikov said to me as we were parting, said, how did he put it? Something about, if Columbia can't live up to its BS, nobody can, or something. It's like, that's nice sentiment. Thank you, love it. But I think he's well featured in a book called Hitman, which is this.
I know the name was.
Yeah, familiar. It's a book that visits the seedier side of the music business. Yeah.
Well, back to the book as we wind this up a bit. In that, I just want to say I'm very honored to be talking to you.
Oh, Mike, I appreciate that.
If you're enjoying hearing Walter's stories, the book is a must-read. We've only scratched the surface of it. But I wondered about it. As I was reading along, I was thinking to myself, does this guy have an encyclopedic memory? And then I got to a point where you talked about, because of the death of Clarence White, you got into journaling in a big way. And
it was kind of coincidental that he happened to die as I came to that conclusion that I should start writing about this. At that point, I thought it was going to be about Sageworth becoming a big band, and this would have been in like 73, I guess, is when I started doing the journal. But yeah, it was like almost exactly the same day that he had been run over, and I spoke with Chris Darrow about it on the phone when we used to talk on the phone back in those days. But yeah, and I guess we should mention, although this might change, currently the title of the book, with a little bit of misspelling, is going to be Magnetdude, which, of course, once again, a play on words is the way I love to title things. And Magnetdude, My Secrets to Reveal. So we'll see if that makes it to the final edition. But yeah, I have a friend in Washington, D.C. who helps to usher creative books from musical people. There's a guy named Surf who was a DJ in D.C. that he did a book that Stephen Moore is his name. So yeah, hopefully it'll be more and not less.
Well, you don't sugarcoat anything, and I at first brought it up as I went on a roller coaster ride, and I really do think it's almost must reading for somebody that wants to get a real picture of what the
and
music
avoid some
industry
pitfalls that and it's a cliche that you make money, but I had from graduating, I graduated in May of 1970 from college, and we thought the band was going to make it quickly, as my cousin's band did, and we felt we're ready to go. We're going to be stars, or we're going to be at least recording artists. And by the time that I did get it to happen, which was some 7 years later, by the time my first album came out, the success, and then the added-on success of Magnet and Steel the next year, where it really became something. It was like, oh, okay, well now it's easy sailing. Yeah, it's like, oh, got it made. This is, and it's not. you're a band in a local scene, you try to be the best band, and then you try to get signed, and then once you get signed, you're in a whole other bigger pool that other people, these other bands from other places and other artists. And so you're always, you're, and one of the things I was thinking of about the show last night is that you're always, I guess this is true in a lot of creative things, is you're only as good as your last performance or your last, at least in your own mind. And it's like, there's that self-doubt that we talked about earlier that fuels you to keep pushing and to keep trying to be better and trying to be as good as you can be. And there's the insecurity of the creative person, I think, is also a cliche, but it's so true. Because
But I also think that when things are going swimmingly, you said fueled, and what fuels you more is to, have a bad show and want to realize why and fix it.
well, sure, yeah, you always want, I mean, because you're only as good as that particular moment in front of people. If you're singing sourly or if you're playing poorly, it's what they see, it's what they know. It's like, oh yeah, well, you
I don't
should
want
say,
that.
yeah, exactly. And so you have to strive to do your best at every show, and only the people who sort of take it for granted and get to a point where outside influences, a la, alcohol, drugs, whatever, come in and undermine, or or you sort of feel like you have it made, that it falls apart, and that, I don't know whether I sort of subconsciously feel that way, but I've always seemingly liked the earlier albums of groups. I was a huge Doors fan, but they got to a point where they almost became a caricature of themselves. Jim Morrison especially, where it was like, I think his dissipation sort of took away whatever it was that he had, that magic. And of course, when you first start out, you've probably got a backlog of songs and things to give. And then it's like, well, how do you follow the hits? How do you? I mean, Fleetwood Mac, for that matter, is this great example of that.
I was interviewing Suzanne Vega at the
Oh, I
time,
love her.
and it was after, well, it was just as her second album was about to be released, and it wasn't on mic with the interview, but she said, I have had my whole life to come out with my first album. It's got a couple hits on it, and they are expecting another one that's better within months.
Of course, yeah. And that's the thing. There's that magic bubble that might be happening, which I think Hot Summer Nights is an example of that. That I was able to come up with that song basically on request. I was like, okay, go right, yeah, okay, sure. And of course, with their help, I was able to make it into the song that it was. But I was always amazed that that song, being such a personal song about being in bands, and so I figured people in bands would relate to it, but other people relate to it on a whole other level of the kind of nostalgia of the remembering good times and things. But the fact that it was covered in Swedish or Norwegian, Flott Sommer Dag. In French it was called Vandelevla, and there was a German version that I've been trying to track down. I haven't been able to find. I think it was a band called Wooden Nickel. Wooden Nickel was the name of the band.
That's familiar, actually.
Well, if you ever come across that. And then there was a Japanese version of it by a group called Blue or Bluey or something.
There are globally Hot Summer Nights.
Well, yeah, and I think the fact of the hook to that song being the kind of lyricless thing, I think that sticks with people too. And it's a catchy tune, I guess. But and then of course the hit by the group Night, which is another one of those circles that you described earlier, because that was the first song released by Planet Records, which was Richard Perry, world famous producer's his own label, that Night was very much of a Fleetwood Mac kind of clone band. And in fact, their lead singer, I think, was even named Stevie. I think she had that name. And then, some years later, I met Richard through his brother, who was the drummer, Fred Perry, in the Brooklyn Cowboys that I was in. So, yeah, I think the fact that book, I was able to finally write the book. I think, I think there's, things in there that are unusual, to say the least.
And my favorite moment, I believe, in the book, just because I moved my head away from reading it and just pictured this scene, which is Wanda Jackson turning to you and saying, "You're not rocking enough."
You can't write. I mean, you can't make that kind of stuff up. Yeah, well, I'm. The irony of my second album being called Not Shy is the fact that I am really shy. I think of myself as pretty shy anyway. I've overcome some of it, and so I was tentative in playing behind such a legendary person as her. She dated Elvis, for gosh sake, and so to be in her backup band was just a thrill for me. And so I was kind of finding my way and doing a couple of licks, and then she turned to me in her legendary face and said, "What? You're not rocking hard enough. Come on." So that was great. But yeah, I mean, I've been fortunate enough to be in the presence of people like playing with Wanda Jackson, playing with Jackson Browne. I rehearsed with him for the Late for the Sky album, even though that fell apart before. But that falling apart ultimately, I think, led me to having my own deal. Those are the things we didn't fill in on the earlier
let's include
parts.
David Lindley there too.
Yeah, and David Lindley, God rest his soul. Now, David was such a good friend to me when I moved to California. He was Chris Darrow's brother-in-law, and they both were living in Claremont. And David was such a great instrumentalist. So I think he took pity on me and would engage me to drive him to rehearsals and stuff and give me some money for that kind of stuff. And he was such a great player, and yet he would, well, of course, this is probably why, he would rehearse 5-6 hours a day, just sit there playing, and it was like, oh my God, I'm never going to be a player like that. I'm just going to be a songwriter.
And I think anything with a string, you just give it to him, and he's going to make magic.
Yeah, well, Kaleidoscope was a great band that he was in. But yeah, I mean, the things we haven't even touched on it. The fact that I got to play bass for the band Spirit for 3 years, and that was a great band, Randy California.
I didn't know that until I read the book.
Yeah, well, it's not a big, well-known fact. We were in the touring band. I never really got to record except a few things with them.
I know there's
a recording of doing Magnet and Steel with Randy singing, which is kind of cool.
You said there's stuff, and I said, we're only scratching the surface.
Yeah.
Is there something important we should talk about before we wrap this up?
Gosh, I don't know. Well, the fact that I'm continuing to write and record. On a good day, I have a good relationship with Robert over in England. And Red Steel Music has been putting out my albums. There's at least 2 or 3 that we've already planned and that are already in the can to be released, if anybody cares. And that's the other part of the discussion that could take a few hours, of why people, if they loved those songs from back then, why they don't want to pay attention to the newer stuff. But we songwriters have to keep writing, and that's what we do. So. And for that matter, you never know, and that's the other, idiom of the music business. There's the BS part of it, but there's also the you never know. You write a song, and you might like it, or you might not think it's so great. Someone will hear it, and they go, "Oh, this is the best song I ever heard," and then they'll go take it somewhere, and there you go,
And on the other side of that, I like to think that music is the soundtrack for my days.
Yeah.
And I just want to thank you for being part of that soundtrack.
Oh, well, I appreciate that, Mike. And one more thing, I guess I should mention this, although It is still about to happen as we speak here in March of 2024. I am about to be to get a radio show on a station here in Nashville called Hippie Radio that we're calling Walt's Record Vault, where I will revisit those great tunes from what I consider the hippie era, which is 66 to 72. And so we're going to be on Sunday nights.
Well, you know, and it's not exactly a throwaway to not to mention that you are in the LA Hall of Fame.
Oh, the California Music Hall of Fame, yes. I mean, it's a great honor, and it's a wonderful thing to say. The fact that I don't recognize half the people that are going to be inducted with me tempers that a bit, but you know, I mean, it is what it is, and it's a great thing. I've also been named the substitute teacher of the month in Williamson County.
I was going to mention
last
that.
month. So you know, it's all. And I mean, as we went to breakfast yesterday, and I encountered one of my old students. I mean, that to me, that's a great thrill. Is the fact that they remember me and they've touched their lives even as a substitute teacher, which is, you know, usually. I mean, I guess I remember a few of the substitutes when I was in high school, but, you know, I mean, I think there's things to be accomplished in this life that we don't even know we're going to do. I think our children might be our greatest accomplishment, despite what our personal ego satisfactions might be. You know, it's like, who knows what's coming next. So.
Well, early on when I was teaching, I was told by my staff developer, look, they are not going to remember any math lesson, but if you illustrate your passion, that is what's going to stay with them. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure you do that as a sub.
Yeah, well, actually, there's a song I wrote, I think I put it on one of my obscure albums called True Songs, which I put out in 2017. And it's called People Remember How You Make Them Feel, which is ultimately what you're saying there. It's like it's not so much what it is, but it's how they feel and how you connect with them in a human kind of way. And that's the way to do it, I think.
I was so happy to finally see you. I have been listening to your music right from the start. And again, I mentioned before that it's been soundtrack. And I realized there was, you know, a little bit of a buzz and an amp here and there and a small place. But I love the concert.
Well, thank you.
Great time.
Well, you know, as I call albums Apocalypso Now and Walternative, and I make Myth America. I try to play with words for things. When I came up, Ronnie Krasinski, who recorded most every album I did over the last 10, 15 years as the drummer, Ronnie had some health issues, and about 3 or 4 months ago I got in touch with him and he said, you know, I got a pacemaker and I'm feeling great, and you know, I'd love to play with you again. And so I was like, okay, because I did a show last August here locally, and pulling together the band, I really like those musicians, but in order to get everyone rehearsed and to get everything the way I think it should be for a show is a project. And things being what they are, people are more apt to pay money to go see a tribute band with music they love than to come out and listen to original music that they may not have heard before. So I'm laboring under those conditions for a long time. So it just occurred to me that I could call it the Last Waltz, but spell it W-A-L-T apostrophe S, you know, and so that was kind of a joke, but then I thought, okay, yeah, why not? Because I don't know. I mean, my peer group are dropping like flies somewhat. I mean, there's a woman named Ezra Mohawk, who was a good friend of mine, who I co-wrote with, died recently, and David Lindley, and I mean, Dwayne Scott, the engineer that I talked about earlier, he passed away recently too. So we don't know how long we've got left, and so with that in mind, and with the fact that after having open heart surgery 10 years ago, and after sort of the forced retirement of COVID years, where gigs weren't very prevalent, to stand in front of an audience for 2 or 3 hours and sing these songs is a lot for me to do. So I have to really go into training to do it, and it's really not a lucrative gig. It's more, I love to do it. I love to be able to play my songs for people, and so I called it the Last Waltz. Not really fleshing it out as, is this really your last concert? Because I am booked to do some of these yacht rock.
We didn't talk about that.
We haven't even spoken about yacht rock, which the rebranding of the smooth soft rock of the mid 70s to the early 80s that Magnet and Steel fortunately falls into. And so yeah, I'm doing a show with Ambrosia at the end of next month, and I'm doing a lot of those shows. But those are like victory laps. I get to do the hits. I do 3 or 4 songs. I might do a Spirit song, or I might do a Fleetwood Mac song. Actually, Dreams was on my last album, and so I do that Stevie song. But yeah, it's like this might be the last. People aren't clamoring for me to come and play my original stuff from 15 different CDs.
I was on the verge of tears with Old Photographs.
Oh, thank you. Well, I feel like that's a special song that came to me. Well, now it's like 14 years ago, I guess. But I think what I've learned about songwriting is the hardest thing is simplicity, and to be able to make a statement and to have a profound effect with a few words in a small idea, or a big idea, but in a small way, And so I feel like that is a special song, and I appreciate that you like that. And I still think that has more to do, more to give to the world than people know about yet. But
yeah, Jim thinks it should be, in your soundtrack.
Yeah, well, I think that's probably a good place for it to get to the next level, because Red Steel has put it out as a single, but they don't promote these things. They put them out, and they're there if people are looking for them, or if one of us promotes it for it. But yeah, I hope that this book has the effect of bringing attention to a lot of the music that has kind of gone Walter under the bridge, as you might say.
And a CD that goes along with it. I know that the book kind of leads into that with little buttons, at least on the early copy of it.
Yeah.
But it's like,
well,
if you can, even like Back to Sageworth and things like that, if people as they read it are gonna want to hear it.
Well, funny you should mention that, because I have re-recorded the songs that I wrote for Sageworth with Ronnie here in my studio, and that's one of the on deck CDs that the label in England wants to put out, and yeah, then Magnetdude is a possible title for the next CD after Pluck that he wants to promote. But it's hard to tie in the breadth of that book with, it would have to be like a 4-album set or something for it to really get the full,
But people are going to want to say, oh, that's a great story about that song.
Well, yeah,
Let me hear it again.
Well, your lips to the promoter's ears, as they say. But no, I appreciate that. And that was the thing. I mean, and we did about a 2-hour show last night, and I've been rehearsing for it for like 2 months here, pretty much almost every day, sitting here and singing, or standing here and singing, and trying to get my chops back with that I don't use too often. And so It was fun for me, and it was a pleasure, and it was also frustrating and chaotic. As you said, my amp was buzzing, and I couldn't figure out how to get past that. And even though we did 3 rehearsals, only one rehearsal was able to get through all of the material, even of those 20 songs that we did last night. And the crowd seemed to enjoy it, and ultimately that's why I'm happy that we were able to
take out seems to. I know the crowd enjoyed it.
Oh, okay. Well,
I heard enough of them outside
well,
as they were leaving
well,
saying that was a great concert.
I appreciate you and Jim making all this effort to come down and to document this, because I mean, it is special to me that that you're paying it, that you guys are paying attention to it, and that you feel.
For what it's worth, I'm going to have friends back in Delaware who are going to say, "How was the concert?" And I'm going to say, "It was great."
Oh, well, I appreciate that, Mike. And yeah, I mean, I think there certainly were a lot of good moments in it. But of course, on stage you only hear the mix that you're hearing on stage. So, but the response that I got online since the show last night, I thought, oh, okay, well maybe it wasn't what I thought it was at the time, and the frustration and the exhaustion that hit me at the end of the 2 hours on stage.
I think you're okay. You're going to make it.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that, Mike.
Yeah, let it roll!